Hello, my name is Nils Grandelius. I'm a Grandmaster from Sweden. Today I want to show you a game between Grandmaster Boris Gelfand and Grandmaster Wang Yue, played in Romania in 2010. And I want to show this game because it's a very nice illustration of how to utilize a space advantage. And also some interesting strategic aspects in relation to that. So Gelfand with white, very classical player, has a very solid repertoire, starts with d4. And Wang Yue, in those years, this is roughly 10 years ago, he was known to be incredibly solid with black, a very, very tenacious defender, and often not minding going for quite passive positions, knowing fully well that he would be able to hold them. So he goes d5, c4, c6, Slav defense, knight c3, knight f6, and here, of course, knight f3 would be the main move, but Gelfand plays e3, which is also very solid. And now a6, the Chebanenko system. A system of defense which aims at keeping the bishop open to go to f5 or to g4. And a bit more flexible compared to, for instance, e6, which would block the bishop. So a6, Chebanenko system, knight f3. Now there are many moves. I have played actually against Gelfand. I've played bishop f5 myself. Bishop g4 is another move, and b5, as Wang Yue played, is probably the main one. And here white can also play b3, but Gelfand played c5, and this already signifies what his strategy will resolve around in this game. Basically his pawn is now advanced, and he has some space advantage on the queen side. Wang Yue plays g6. Of course the bishop doesn't do a lot on this diagonal, so it makes sense to put it on g7 on the long diagonal and then try to break with e5. Gelfand follows up in the most natural way, but also quite ambitious. Knight e5, bishop g7, f4. So now his knight is very strong on e5, guarded by the two pawns, and this in combination with the pawn on c5 does already give him a space advantage. As compensation, the black's position is quite solid. There are no clear weaknesses. After a5, it's very difficult for white to open up the queen side. If white goes a4, black goes b4, and vice versa. Sacrifices on b5 are not quite possible yet. So it's hard to break through with white. But a space advantage is a very long-term advantage. So there are definitely grounds for optimism. Bishop e2, both players now just develop their pieces. Queen c7, preparing to be able to go knight b7 without the pawn on c6 hanging. Short castle, and now a nice move by Gelfand. He plays a2, a3, and the point is that the only weak square in his camp is the square on e4, and it's guarded by the knight on c3. That's why black in this position would like to play b4, kick the knight away, and then maybe enter on e4, or at least threaten to enter on e4. So white plays a3, Gelfand plays a3 to stop b4. Now if b4, white can take, and the rook and a8 would be hanging. So a3 an important move, and typical prophylactic thinking when having a space advantage. Bishop e6, developing the bishop. Bishop f3, again guarding this the only weak square in the position. G4 was possible and was a bit more aggressive, but it's also slightly risky because after knight e4, black could try to play f5 or even f6, and it could be that the pawn on g4 is a little bit overextended. So bishop f3 played, knight bd7, and when you have a lack of space, or when you have less space in your opponent, then it's usually a very good idea to try to trade pieces, because if you trade more pieces, your position will be less cramped. So that's knight bd7 with ID knight takes e5, is answered by knight d3, simply keeping the pieces. Now all 32 pieces are on the board, which means that the space advantage is a relevant factor here. Here, Wang Yue does go for a slightly surprising idea, and then quite a passive one, in fact. He plays the move h6. A more natural move would for sure have been to play bishop f5 and try to enter on the square e4. After which white has two interesting options. He can play knight f2, as Gelfand in his excellent book Dynamic Positional Play has annotated this game and said he wanted to play knight f2, after which he felt that he was a bit better, and after b4 I think instead of Gelfand's taking, maybe knight e2 is even stronger, and white does keep some edge, but still this is progress for black to have the bishop on f5 and then try to trade it off either with bishop e4, or if white doesn't move then take the knight on d3. h6 does have some active idea to play g5, but Gelfand's next move stops that, and it's very strong. He plays g4 simply to stop bishop f5, and now the bishop on e6 looks very clumsily placed. It cannot move, and white is not yet threatening to play f5, but he will be soon, so that explains the next decision. He could have tried to play h5. This is a very typical try in such positions. Point is, if white advances, then when black moves the knight to h7 or e8, then you have the square on f5 stabilized for the bishop, and this gives black some stability. But after h5 it was possible to play h3, keeping the pawn safely protected, and then bit by bit improving. So h5 doesn't quite help. Instead, Wang Yue played knight h7, and here is maybe the only moment in the game where Gelfand's choice can be criticized. Here it would make a lot of sense to make some preparatory move. Like, one idea that I like is to play knight e2 to put the knight on g3, because as we said, it is blocked on the queen side if a4 b4 and if b4 a4. So it has to be on the king side and the center, and therefore the knight should go from c3 to g3. After which black plays maybe f5, knight g3, and white has some pressure here for sure. In the game, Gelfand wanted to get even more, and a little bit too fast in my opinion. He plays h4, very natural move, worked out well in the game, but h5 was a very interesting response. Looks like white just can win a pawn with taking twice on h5, but then in fact it's not so easy, because black plays knight f6, bishop goes back, then king h8, and lots of natural moves now. Rook g8, bishop h6, maybe the bishop comes to f5 or g4, and there is surprisingly much compensation, I would say. It's not a clear position at all. So this probably was a little bit unnecessary to allow. But after h4, Wang Yue underestimated the pawn sacrifice and instead went for f5, after which Gelfand obviously plays g5, gaining even more space. Now he has a space advantage with the pawn on c5, but also with the pawn on g5. And black's position is really, really cramped. Like, very few of his pieces can move a lot. The question could be asked, why not block with h5? Now it's almost entirely blocked, right? But not quite, because with such a nice space advantage, very often you can make use of the idea to sacrifice a piece for two pawns. For instance, here, knight g3, and sooner or later white will take on h5 with a very strong initiative. Let's say e6, bishop d2, rook fb8, or any other move. Then even already here, maybe knight takes h5 is interesting, also not necessary to do immediately. But in such positions you have these two pawns, and black's pieces are still as bad as before, and it's very, very unpleasant for black to defend. So Wang Yue tried to take on g5 instead. H takes, and now the position has stabilized. White has this nice space advantage, but black is solid and it's very difficult to break through. So the next couple of moves, very natural. White is trying to bring all his pieces to the h file, the only open file, and also to put some pressure on the pawn on g6. So it can be done in many different ways, but what he does is very natural. Black is mainly waiting as well. The problem for black is if he runs with the king to the queen side, which would be natural. That's what you often do to defend in such positions. Problem here is that white will probably be able to sacrifice a piece on this side instead. Take on b5 and get 2 pawns there, and if then the black king is on the queen side, then it's very scary for him. So instead black waits. Well, again, we should mention this Wang Yue, he's not averse to just waiting. He had a very passive style, but very robust and very, very hard to break through. So he waits. Not that much is going on. Rook h1. And here he does take a controversial decision here. It was possible to play something like any waiting move really. Maybe rook a7, or yeah, could put it on e7, or I mean any move just to defend the pawn on a5 and to try to keep the bishops on g7 and g8, trying to cover all these squares, and ask white how he's breaking through. This was possible, but and then white would probably have to, for instance, maybe get this knight to e5, maybe look for ways to sacrifice on b5, or even to sacrifice on f5. I mean, there are some ideas. Black is solid, but incredibly passive, and it's quite risky. Instead, Wang Yue put his bishop on h7 simply to physically block the h file. Now he thinks that if he can just defend the bishop on h7, white can't break through. But Gelfand triples on the h file, brings all the pieces there. Some repetition doesn't hurt when you have endless time, which you have when you have such nice control. Rook h6. Now you can't kick the rook away because rook takes h7 will come, and white is winning a piece. So he continues to wait with rook e7, and now all the pieces are on the h file. Everything looks nice, but white needs to make progress, and Gelfand finds a very nice idea to make progress. He understands that one very important detail is that the pawn on a5 is quite difficult to defend, especially as both the rooks have to stay on the 7th rank to defend the bishop on h7. So he finds the very nice maneuver knight e2, and the idea is simply to go knight c1, knight b3, and put pressure on the pawn. He was allowed to show it in the game. Wang Yue continued to wait. Knight b3. Now if queen d8, white can put additional pressure, so you would anyway have to move the pawn with a4. So Wang Yue moved immediately, but now okay, it doesn't look like much. Took many moves to provoke, and it's still safely protected, but it's actually a very important step for white, because now you have the b4 square for the knight. He plays knight c1, knight d3, and now you can use the square on b4 or the square on e5 for the knight. And later on, very importantly, white will be able to break with b3. And this is a key concept in such positions. When you have such a significant edge on one side, like he has here with the tripling on the h file, then very often the way to break down your opponent's defense is to switch to the other side and make something happen there. So here black has to stay with almost all of his pieces to defend on the king side, which means that at some point this b3 break will be very strong. But now he was first trying to find out how to make progress on the king side. So he plays knight h4, and here the game is starting to really heat up, because now there are some threats. So let's say you play rook c7 here, or rook e7, or a waiting move like that. Then white can actually break through immediately with the help of a temporary sacrifice. He can play knight takes g6. Can't take with the bishop because the bishop is hanging, so you have to take with the knight. And now simply bishop h5, threatening to take after recaptures. Bishop is hanging, and there is no good defense. I mean, how to recapture. So this would actually break through. For instance, bishop g7, you can even take on g6, and after bishop takes, rook h8 would be a very nice way to pick up the queen after takes, and rook takes here, after which white is easily winning. So it actually is a major threat. That's why Wang Yue decides to move the bishop from this vulnerable h8 square, plays bishop g7, But now Gelfand has planned a nice way to break down the defenses. He takes on h7. Okay, king takes is suicide because knight takes f5 discovered check. So you have to take with the knight. And now the next move, knight takes g6. Very strong. Because queen takes g6, bishop h5 actually traps the queen. So only move to defend is to try to bring more pieces to the king side. He goes knight d7 with ID knight f8. And if white were to take, then now you can take, because bishop h5, then the rook is hanging on h7. So that's not possible, but bishop h5 is very, very strong. And what has happened is that white sacrificed the rook for a bishop and a pawn, but all his pieces are now very, very active. There are many threats, and black is as passive as before, if not even more. So queen d8 was played in the game. Knight b4 attacks this pawn on c6, rook c7, and here comes a very, very important and nice moment in the game as well. You can play here with white knight h4, maybe knight f3, and someday maybe jump to e5 with when you have both the knights there. Maybe bring the king over to the queen side and then break with b3 someday. I mean, it's a very, very promising position, or probably close to winning. But there is also a way to do it much more elegantly and very nicely. And that is to make use of a very surprising tactic. Gelfand here plays knight h8. I mean, completely brilliant concept actually. The point is simply that it's almost impossible to recapture the knight, or to capture the knight. You should capture with the king, then bishop g6. It's very, very strong. For instance, king g8, bishop takes h7, king f7, and now white is still in exchange down, but has the very strong resource bishop g6 check. And if king takes, then rook h7, threatening mate in 1, and after king f7, g6, white is simply breaking through, based, for instance, on the tactic king f8, rook takes g7, and when you take back, there is checkmate. So king takes h8, bishop g6 seems to work, or it is working, it's winning for white. Instead, bishop takes h7 I think will be the same, check, king takes, rook takes. You have to block with the bishop, and g6 is the same position, so this is also winning. So only move for black is after knight h8 not to capture the knight, but to play knight df8 to keep the knight overprotected on h7. But here there are again many ways, and again Gelfand finds a very elegant solution. Plays knight f7, really entering into the heart of the black position. If you now move the queen, then the knight can continue to d6, which would be have devastating effect. So Wang Yue took, bishop takes, rook takes, and now rook takes h7. The final tactical point of the game. Of course, knight takes h7, then g6, attacking both the knight and the rook. And here, for instance, takes and just bishop h4. White is still actually, in technical terms, material down. Only a knight and the pawn for the rook, 4 against 5. But it doesn't take long to realize that the white position is completely overwhelming and quite easily winning here. There are simply too many threats. So rook takes h7. Wang Yue decided to fight on with queen e8, but now Gelfand was a pawn up and converted in a very nice fashion. Not that difficult, but still very nice. He goes queen h5 mainly to go to h7, threatening rook h6. So queen g8, just trade it. And here, the last important detail of the game is that as black has played a4, it will now be possible to open up on the queen side with b3, which he does very nicely. Yeah, many moves, but finally b3 comes, and yeah, then if black takes, then a4 will come, and And the position is opened up, and the extra pawn is enough to win easily. So he just enters here, and very soon Wang Yue decides he had enough. So knight to e5 and push the g-pawn. And the g-pawn and the knight is too strong. Black will have to go over with the king to defend, but then white will enter on b6. So after knight f6, g7, Wang Yue decided to resign. Very, very nice technical and strategic performance by Gelfand, really showing the strength of a slight space advantage, and how, if you build it up step by step, it can be almost impossible for the opponent to defend against all the threats. This was Nils Grandelius for Lichess, and thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed, and see you next time.